Deputy Director of Student Education in the Politics and International Relations Department at University of Leeds, and is also an Associate Professor of British Politics. I think Crossman is your particular speciality.
Yes, me and Stephen Thornton, we are the Crossman people.
Yes. Excellent. So just in terms of housekeeping, 3 points really. First of all, please keep your microphones off because that does improve the sound quality for everybody. Secondly, we are recording the seminar, and that will be published on the PSA's YouTube channel. So if you don't want to be seen, please have your camera turned off. And finally, if you have questions for Victoria, please put them in the chat box. Once Victoria's presentation's completed, I'll then take questions from the chat box, putting them together where necessary, if there are a lot of them, and pass those to Victoria for answering. So without further ado, over to you, Victoria.
Thanks, John. Before you were all admitted, I was just saying to John how quickly we get out of practice. I was saying that, you know, I'm so used to walking in and out of seminar rooms every week and it's just part of the job, but I've actually been strangely nervous about this. It seems like a very long time since I actually spoke to people that were live that weren't members of my family or members of my immediate kind of department. So you will have to forgive me if I fluff my lines a little bit. But it's just the excitement of seeing new and exciting people. So I can't bear watching myself on screen. So I'm going to put up a PowerPoint and hopefully it's going to remind me about the things that I actually need to talk to you all about. So I suppose where I'm coming from with this is that the title of this is The Things We Gained During the Lockdown. But the subtitle of this is Things We Lost in the Fire, which is a book I am ashamed to say I haven't actually read. But for some reason, the title stuck with me. And it kind of came to mind kind of the mid to the end of last year, where I just thought, I'm so sick of being miserable. I'm so sick of firefighting and feeling like I'm in survival mode all the time. And I think we all feel that all of the time. And I don't just mean in our personal lives where, you know, we're dealing with being at home and worrying about our families and worrying about our homeschooling and all of those kind of things. I mean, actually, in terms of our career, the last academic year felt like we were clinging on by our fingertips. There may have been people who were really, you know, fantastically well equipped for it, but for most of us, it just felt like we were surviving week on week, sometimes day on day. And I just thought, I can't do this anymore. I want to think about the things that have actually been really good, the things that have pushed us forward. Universities are perhaps, and it's a debate that you can have in another place at another time if you wanted, relatively liberal in outlook, but they are fairly conservative with a small c in terms of the way that they do things. And I do appreciate that it doesn't apply to all departments and it doesn't apply to all universities. But it seems to me that a lot of universities have been pushed into action to do things that many people would have argued they probably should have done previously. I saw a great documentary ages ago with David Attenborough where he was talking about university and his life at university. And really the things he was saying, there was an awful lot of similarities with the way that university life existed at the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century. So I wanted to think about the things that had been good about lockdown, the things that had worked really well for us, the things that when we go back to normal that we might want to try and keep, as well as also embracing some of the things that we maybe don't want to keep, or I suppose trying to provide a more balanced picture. If you ever speak to anybody within kind of any field of teaching or research, you can find certain individuals who are quite evangelical about what they do. And I think that we have to try and be even-handed about this. And I'm sure that they would be as well. And that's what I want to try and do. So to try and be even-handed, I'm going to start by talking about the bad stuff, because I think we have to face the fact that online teaching has not worked well for everything. And if we can deal with the bad stuff, then we can move on to the good stuff and try and think about the things we want to keep. So the first thing that is most obvious to all of us, I mean, I'm very much preaching to the converted here, is the lack of human contact. And I'd like to point out that you should not be touching your students in any way, shape or form. But the idea of actually being in touch with our students, actually being able to see them in a meaningful sense, being able to spot the person at the back of the room who looks like maybe they're not really understanding what they're talking about, being able to see the person who's got that confused look on their face, that isn't always easy. And I don't know about your universities, but my university at the University of Leeds has spent an awful long time trying to figure out what the policy about cameras is. Should you enforce cameras? Does that have disability issues and privacy issues that come with it? What about people whose Wi-Fi isn't really great? How do we balance all of these different considerations? What we end up with is very few students who switch on their cameras. It's the same faces that I see week in, week out. I did have one lovely student who did his seminars from his bed, which was perhaps not ideal, but nonetheless, at least he switched his camera on, at least I could see him. You see the same faces, you hear the same voices. Now, these are not new problems. We've all been in seminar rooms where you have students who, despite your very best efforts, will not talk. But there's more places to hide online, and that has obviously been a problem. There are some semi-solutions to this. Breakout rooms work very well. I have a third year module where I send them into breakout rooms, and they're more likely to talk to one another than they are to talk in a much greater group. But even then, you do still see the same voices, hear the same voices, see the same faces again and again. So that's a problem. Online conversation can be really stilted and difficult to coordinate. You've got Wi-Fi problems, delay problems, whatever it may be. It's difficult. I hadn't appreciated really how difficult it was to get over nuance when you can't really see somebody, and that should be strange to me because I talk largely with my hands. But it's very difficult if you can't see someone to understand all of the nuances in what they're saying. It can lead to conversations going in directions that you didn't anticipate that they would, or that they maybe wouldn't have done in a classroom. So that's something that needs to be considered. There's also concerns from students over the effectiveness of online teaching. It seems to me, as someone who is a member of a university, but not an extremely high-ranking member of a university, that certain members of the university sector have spent quite a long time critiquing online learning, saying that it really wasn't the real deal, that it wasn't as good. Now, whether or not you agree with that, and I think that argument has some strengths and some weaknesses, when you move everything online, you then have students who start parroting that back to you and saying, well, you told us that it wasn't as good. You told us that it didn't stack up. And that is a very difficult thing to hear when, as we all know, you're working your backside off in order to get your online teaching to where you want it to be. And I think that in the future, I hope in the future, that we will see less of those arguments because universities are embracing more online teaching and are recognising the value of online teaching. And hopefully those arguments will dissipate. I hope. I'm an eternal optimist. There's also issues of inclusivity. I think that some people hoped that the move to more online teaching would lead to more kind of a natural inclusivity, that people would be able to be included because there wasn't such a kind of geographical factor to people coming into the seminar room. But actually, it's just raised a whole heap more problems. Does your Wi-Fi work? Can you get onto your Wi-Fi? Is there enough space, both physically and kind of more metaphysically, in your domestic situation to be able to go to your seminars, all of those kind of things? Do you have the tech? How expensive is it? Can you access it? All of those kind of things. So I think that people thought that maybe online teaching would eradicate them, and actually it just changed out some of the problems for slightly other problems that we don't necessarily have great answers to. And that leads on to technical issues for both staff and students, issues of Wi-Fi, microphones, cameras. Does your laptop run all of the latest stuff? I had a wonderful colleague who didn't realize that his laptop wasn't working as it should be, and did some massive update on it and got about 6 months worth of notifications that he didn't realize that he wasn't getting. All of these things are important for us and for our students as well, because without them, we can't do our job. Lack of technical knowledge, I think, has been a huge problem for us, and hopefully something that we are dealing with. At most universities, a lot of academics, not all, because some were already experts at what they did, they had to have a kind of crash course on how to use Zoom, Teams, Blackboard Collaborate Ultra. We sat in on sessions like this while people walked us through how to use these kind of things. We've all moved enormously in a year. That doesn't make us experts. It doesn't mean that we can work all of the stuff brilliantly. I managed to send out 23 individual invites to over 200 students because I couldn't work Teams properly at the start of the year. I'm assured I'm not the only person who's made these mistakes, but we are all getting better. But we did have a quite crushing lack of technical knowledge. My husband is a geologist. His company have been using Teams for over a year before we started using Teams. He was actually talking me through it, strangely enough, in Christmas 2019, because we live that exciting kind of life. So there was a lack of technical knowledge, and you've got to think that that extends to our students as well. They don't necessarily know how to use all of this stuff, even though we assume that they're all digital natives and they know, or they can navigate their way around. It isn't always the case. We know that lack of face-to-face teaching has been hugely problematic for the mental health of students and of staff. I don't think I had quite anticipated or grasped how much I was going to miss bumping into colleagues going for a cup of tea, or bumping into people on the stairs, or just having students coming and knock on my door and asking just a really quick and easy question, or even walking into a lecture theatre and seeing everybody there. And our students have had that tenfold. I'm not here to talk about that. We know all about that. But that is something I think that we will probably want to tackle in a number of different ways when we get back to whatever normal looks like. There is an argument that social isolation can limit creativity and the ability to work together. I think that probably can in those kind of accidental meetups. If you're not accidentally bumping into somebody, then it's a lot harder to work with them. But we do still reach out to people. There's still lots of opportunities to do that. It just depends on how you build your relationships. People can disappear. And I don't just mean students, I mean staff. It can be hard to keep a track of everybody. And that's a problem that you don't have when you know that somebody's in the office down the road. Although having said that, we are in a kind of profession where people can disappear, particularly staff. Students, the universities tend to keep a much closer eye on, but staff can literally come in for classes and then you never see them from month to month. So I don't think it's necessarily a new problem, but it is something that we're realising. And then to complete my list of horror, burnout. I don't know about you, I'm on my knees most of the time. I feel I don't think I've ever worked as hard as I've worked in the last year, and yet I feel like I've accomplished less than I do in every other academic year. So these are, as far as I can see, a list of the most kind of striking bad things that we want to deal with or that we've had to tackle in the past year. And now I really want to move on to the good stuff, because I think that there has been some really great stuff that has come out in the last year. So some of these bits and pieces will be dealt with just by being back on campus. We'll go back on campus, rain, confetti, rain will fall from the sky, everything will be brilliant, everyone will be happy. It won't. We know that there will be a backlog. We know that many people, staff, students will be dealing with the fallout of this for years to come. But to some degree, getting back on campus will help these things. It will allow a more face-to-face teaching. It will allow us to engage with our students more, although catch-up is an issue. Many of you will have school-age children. I have school-age children myself. Catch-up is an increasing issue that we need to think about, because we want our students to leave universities with degrees that count. It's not about being generous to them. It's about creating a level playing field for them and making sure that their degree is as valuable as the degree from the same university 3 years ago or 5 years in the future. But I really want us to think about what the new normal is going to look like. And I think in many ways it has pushed us forward. I do think that universities have been encouraged, tempted, forced to invest in tech. And they've been pushed to not just invest in tech, but to actually get academics to use it in a more fulfilling way. So for example, the University of Leeds, we have Blackboard Collaborate Ultra. We've had it for a while, but actually very few people used it to the capabilities of the system. They used it for bits and pieces because that was what suited their particular modules. We've now been forced to learn how to do these things, and it's pushed us forward in terms of what we want to use, what we can use. And it's removed the fear, because for many of us, we didn't use these things because we were a bit worried about making a mess of it. Well, we had no choice. So I think that that's been important. I think it's also focused the minds of some within the university sector about how much money is required in order to build these things and buy these things and maintain these things. So, you may have different teaching systems in your universities. I know of at least 2 new ones coming on down the track that will almost certainly not replace, but will be strong competitors to things like Teams teaching or Blackboard Collaborate Ultra. This is where the big money is. The universities are being asked to trial them, they're being asked to introduce them, they're looking at being sold as products. There is now money to be made. This is a big new market, or a big emerging market, I should say, rather than a new market. And the universities are therefore having to spend money on things like, how do we service these things? How many people do we need in an IT department when we've gone from having, I don't know, 50% of our students and staff online at any one time to having 80% of our students and staff online at any one time? How much money is required in order to turn fairly traditional seminar rooms or lecture theatres into hybrid teaching environments? How much tech do we need? I don't know about you, I saw those really fancy pictures that came out from Harvard of the lecturer who had all the digital screens behind them and then all of the students in front of them. There are some universities that can do that. There are some very, very fancy tech rooms. There aren't that many, certainly not enough to be able to create a hybrid teaching environment for all of the students or staff who might want to do it. And yet universities are beginning to face the fact that they need more students than perhaps their campuses can cope with, that actually students might have other responsibilities in their lives. They might have children, they might be geographically far away, they might have other alternatives that, that require them to join lectures at different times or have them recorded. So the universities, I think, have been forced to deal with these issues that they would have dealt with eventually, but it's accelerated change. I've already said about them being conservative places and about a sense of fear. I won't stress the point. But I think that there is an expectation now, that certainly seems to me in my reading of the situation, and I may well be wrong, you might have a different viewpoint, that the universities are being pushed into action that probably would have come, but has been accelerated absolutely massively. So what's worth keeping? Technical know-how. We've all learned so much more. I am a much better online teacher than I was a year ago, and I was a better online teacher last February than I was the December before it. We've all learned everything. It hasn't been easy. Some have learnt faster, quicker, more effectively than others, and that has been problematic. But I think that the online resources that our students are getting are impressive. There may be worries amongst the government and the Office of Students as to whether or not students are getting a high quality education. It seems to me, from looking at my colleagues, watching the stuff that we're all doing, I don't just mean at the University of Leeds, I mean across different universities, it really seems that we've pulled all the stops out. We've done the absolute best that we could. And you might want to argue that's not as effective as being in a classroom, but I think that we've really done the very best that we could. And that perhaps by having a more hybrid approach, we'll be able to get real modern teaching. And I don't say modern in the sense that modern is always better, but I think that it can have real advantages for expanding the student cohort, not just in terms of numbers, but in terms of experience. We've long talked about the issues of widening participation, about the cost of going to university. Hybrid teaching may potentially be one way of dealing with that. The idea that you don't necessarily have to live on campus, or that you don't necessarily have to attend a university that close to your home all of the time. You could be there at certain points and maybe not at others. These are the questions that are now being considered. If you could get a hybrid style of teaching, then it seems to me that there would be lots of advantages to that, but there are also disadvantages to that, because there are certain things that students and staff love about the traditional student experience. The idea of us all being together, the idea of a kind of collective student experience, the idea of going off to university, not just for the education that you receive, but also for the friends that you make and the experiences that you have. And I think that those kind of elements, some will want to keep, but I think it'll be interesting to see whether we get a broadening out of the university experience beyond what we've already got, so that you see different experiences of university. But that requires the universities to put money into it, and it requires us to be supported to provide the high standards that are required for all of those students, whatever their experience. And obviously more diversity, more different things usually requires more people. Online teaching is not the cheap, quick solution. It is expensive. It takes time if you're going to do it properly. And therefore that requires money, which is at the root of all of these things. I did briefly want to talk about the equality issue here. the reason that I wanted to mention it was because in many ways I feel there's been a leveling down, and I don't say that in a positive way, obviously. As a female member of staff, I have spoken to countless other female academics over the years, and this is not a universal experience. It's untrue to say all women have the same experience in academia, but there are certain similarities among certain sectors that you find. I went on a course many years ago, and it was about women leaders in academia, and the first female professor of physics in Sheffield was giving the keynote speech, and somebody asked her about childcare challenges that she'd had over the years, because her husband, I think, was an academic as well, and they'd had a nanny, and she said, you know, we can't all afford nannies, what would you suggest? And she said, well, I mean, the obvious solution to this is an au pair. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily want to get them when they're really little, but, you know, get an, and we were thinking, well, we were looking for a little bit more than that, because actually au pair's a bit beyond our financial stretch as well. There is this kind of old-fashioned idea, which is dying out, of traditional male academics who have wives or partners at home, who basically pick lives so that they can get on with being brilliant and clever and fabulous. I do appreciate that it is a dying stereotype. Most of my male colleagues, some of whom I see on this webinar, don't have those kind of lifestyles. But I do think that there has been an unfortunate leveling down, because many of the things that I have heard some female colleagues complain about are now the same things that I hear male colleagues complain about. Issues relating to work-life balance, issues relating to having children at home, the idea of not being able to attend late night talks, not being able to go off to conference for several weeks, or participate in long-standing issues because of these lockdown restraints. And in some ways, I think that you can benefit from a certain technical slant to this. You know, I've attended talks online that I would never have been able to go to in real life. I physically never could have got there. I've been able to participate in things that I would physically never have been able to get there. And I think that that's really impressive and really useful. And I hope that that will remain. I think that some universities, not all, but some, have been really good at flexible working, because they've had to deal with the idea that academics actually have, and other members of staff have, constraints beyond academia in their lives. They have to go pick their children up. They have to go put their children to bed, those kind of things. They need that kind of flexibility. And I hope that that will remain, because I think that that is incredibly useful for everybody. I hope that by having more technical solutions, we can offer more support to our students. But I should point out that I don't think that that means that we should be working every hour that God sends. This kind of mismatch between home life and academic life can mean that you're answering emails at 10 o'clock at night if you're not careful, or that you're answering emails at weekends if you're not careful. And particularly for early careers colleagues who so want to make a good impression, who so want to be a valuable member of staff, it can be very difficult for them to create those barriers, those lines that say, actually, no, I need my own personal space, because without those, it ends up causing them real serious difficulties in their lives. So I think that if the universities want to offer more support to students, and they're able to in this way, then again, that needs to be carefully considered as to how that's actually going to happen, and which elements of university life should be offering that support. Some of it is more appropriate to come from support services like the counselling service, for example, or medical centres, as opposed to us. But I suppose my question is, has anything really changed? Aren't the challenges still there, only in a slightly different way? And I suppose that is, as far as I can see, true. But there are some changes coming on down the line. As I said, there's more teaching platforms coming, which might make online teaching that bit easier. They might make it a bit more bewildering. You know, you never can tell that the next system is going to be better than the system that you've got. Will universities finally accept online learning as a valid part of degree programs? They may have very little choice in it. It entirely depends. I was reading Glenn O'Hara on Twitter earlier, who was suggesting that there is some evidence to suggest that a fourth wave will peak just as semester one is in kind of prime time of 21-22. So that's something for us all to really look forward to. I do so like to be optimistic in these talks. What I do hope has changed, and what I really, 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 really hope is the case, is that teaching has become more valued in our sector. You know, I can't tell you how many times I have been told, you know, it's all about the research. You know, they sit in their office and they research and they're brilliant researchers. Well, yeah, but how do they get on with students? Oh, we don't let them talk to the students. You know, they give like one talk a year or whatever. Again, a very old fashioned idea. But for some people, teaching is a very, you know, it's the poor relation of our industry. And actually, it's been shot up the rankings because suddenly the universities have realised that not only do they make a lot of money from this, but actually it's really a very, very important part of what we do. So I don't want it to outrank research. I just want it to be recognised as important to research as research to university life. And if it gets just a fraction more attention and a fraction more kudos, then I will be very delighted. And maybe the typical student will change. Location, age, responsibilities, amount of study being undertaken, when they undertake their studies. It's an expensive business being at university. We have students that have jobs. We have students that want to live at home. We have students that come to us later than 18 because they have other things going on. Perhaps all of these things will change because we will have more space. Now, I'm going to wrap up quickly because I know that we need to get to questions, but there are some issues with students because they've been disappointed, and I don't think that these issues should be underestimated. I don't think that they are insurmountable problems, but I do think that they are the things that the students are going to want to focus on in the future. Employability, I think, is high on that list. I know many people don't like the words, but for many individuals, their question is, I've got a degree, I've spent a fortune on it, I'm entering a job market which may not be as buoyant as I had hoped when I leave. How am I going to get a job if there is a depressed economy after COVID? And universities are going to have to not start thinking seriously about that question, because I think they have been thinking seriously about that question, but they're going to have to work on it far more. Students want bang for their buck, and the Office of Students is trying to kind of make that point. Not the greatest lover of the Office of Students, I have to admit, but employability is nonetheless a very big issue, and it seems like it's going to get even bigger in the future. Mental health services are another big issue. I don't know about your university. I am constantly being told that the University of Leeds is spending more on mental health services, and I don't doubt them for a moment. The problem is, whatever is being spent in any university in the country, it's not enough. They're going to need to spend an awful lot on mental health services for students and for staff. And it seems to me that that's going to have to be picked up in the future. How much time and resource do departments need to develop their teaching, and what will be the impact on research? If we value teaching more, which I hope that we will, what does that actually mean for us as academics who teach and research? How do we have the time to do all of these things if all of these things take more time? Because we physically don't have any more time. And at the moment, it's an uneasy balance that's been reached because it's still kind of this emergency situation. How can we appeal to new students? Again, part of WP, do we need to reconsider what their experience is? And what do we need to support staff members from different external pressures? We've all got lots of pressures upon us. We're feeling it from senior managers, students, the Office of Students, and I say that with no kind of complaint about it. There will be people on the call whose children are students. There will be people who are senior managers. It's because we all have different needs and expectations and wants, and we're all trying to do the best from where we're sitting. So how do we create change? Money. It's at the root of all evil, but it's all about money. It's all got to be costed. If you want to spend money, you need more students. You need more students, you need more staff, and we go round and around the roundabout. So it's all about money. We need more staff, not less. Online teaching is not the cheap option. It needs more staff hours if you want to do it properly. We need more support services. If students and staff are remote, you need to invest in people to bridge that gap, even if they're only remote part of the time. If you're hybrid teaching, you still need to keep an eye on where everybody is. And that means both administratively and in terms of pastoral care. And we need interest. We need universities to listen to their staff and students. And I think that some are better than others at this. But the ones that will win in the future are the ones who listen to their staff the closest, because we're all in this together. We're not fighting against senior management in some kind of terrible war. We want universities to continue. We want them to do well. We want what's best for our students as well. So to conclude, COVID's been awful. You see, then you knew there was going to be a revelation. COVID has been awful. But there might be a bit of a silver lining if we all look hard enough. We might be able to have the opportunity to reform aspects of the higher education sector and make it really good, get rid of the stuff, or maybe not all the stuff, but some of the stuff that we didn't like, that didn't work, but was there because it was tradition, because it was expected, because that's what had always been the case, and replace it with something which is actually a bit more fit for purpose in the 21st century, that we can demonstrate the strengths of, that we can show is not some tin pot idea being utilized by half a dozen people who are really tech savvy, that actually this is the way forward, and that we can take a lot of people along with us rather than just a very select few. I've been to conferences and sat and listened to people give amazing presentations about the teaching that they do online and thought, I could never do that in a month of Sundays. Now, I don't claim that I could necessarily do it now, but I could give it a better shot than I could even a year ago. And if we can take more people with us, then that seems to be a very positive thing we could get out of this. And finally, I find it quite difficult to imagine going back to normal, and the uncertainty worries me. But I think by trying to be optimistic, maybe there is a kind of silver lining to all of this, because quite frankly, I'm so sick of being miserable and anxious and all of those kind of things. So I've tried to, I don't know, add a little bit of joy to our lives. It may not have been successful, but it was at least my intention. And I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Victoria. That was really good. It really opened up a range of issues for us, both in terms of, as you say, the awful bits of the last year, but also, you know, the reflections on silver linings of new opportunities and things that had opened up, and the look forward in optimism. I was reflecting in conversation with somebody last week that it's as I recall, it's in the depths of sort of World War II, when some of the kind of planning, such as the Beveridge Report, come forward in terms of building a better future. So maybe there's a you know, maybe there is some element of it has to be awful, and you have to be in a time of crisis to really be able to charter a more positive way forward. There are a number of questions, so if I start off sort of working my way through them, and I'll encourage people to add further questions to the chat. But the first question came up from Amanda Rosen, and you know, I think she's asked if other colleagues on the call could also answer in the chat and give ideas and thoughts. And she said, you know, in terms of teaching and learning centres in universities, what do we think would be useful when, you know, they have a range of offers now, there's various courses, various training, etc. But what do you think would be useful for you going forward? What would you like them to offer that, in your experience, they don't yet?
It's quite complicated problem. The University of Leeds is a pretty big university, and one of the things that I'm actually on a working group for at the moment is that there's so much information, it's actually quite baffling to figure out where the information is that you want to read, and it's also spread across lots of different areas. So we have this division, it used to be called the Staff Development Unit, it's now called OD and PL, and I have no idea what those letters actually mean, but nonetheless they do all of these courses, and I've been to some of them online and they're very good. The library at the University of Leeds have lots of really good courses, there's stuff online from IT, but there's digital education services. There's so much of it that you can't ever find the thing that you want. So I'm not necessarily sure from the University of Leeds perspective, or from my perspective, maybe there's other people from the University of Leeds who are much better at navigating it. But from my perspective, it's not necessarily that we need new material. It's that we need to be able to find the material easily. It needs to be categorized in what I would describe as a kind of layman's approach, because if it's been categorized by people who know really well how to use software, they have their own expectations of it, and it's written in a very specific language. So I had a problem with MediaSite, which is what the University of Leeds use as part of their kind of, you know, the big digital platforms that house everything. And I rang up IT, and it was 3:30 on a Friday, and they had a out of office on, which I was absolutely incensed about because I was desperate to get these lectures uploaded. And the very nice out of office guy said to me, I don't know what system you're talking about. And I was like, but it's the main system that we use for our lecture recording. So he sent me to this kind of advice kind of website that he'd found from the University of Leeds. But because it had been written by someone who really knew the system very well, it had skipped various things that they thought were really obvious that no normal person would need to know. But for someone like me who didn't know the system, I couldn't follow any of it. I got stuck on about step 2 because I didn't know the relevant bit of information. So I think that it isn't just about where it needs to be housed. I think it's that it needs to be logically put forward for people who aren't brilliant on these systems. And I don't care if it's at the library or ODMPL or IT, all of these people are brilliant at what they do. I just need to be able to find it really quickly when I need it. But I'm sure that others will have a much better answer to that question than I do.
Thanks, that's very helpful. Maybe if other colleagues have answers for Amanda, using the chat to give Amanda some answers and feedback would be useful and helpful there. I was struck in your answer there, and also reflecting what you were saying earlier about us trying to use systems that we're unfamiliar with. 2 things. First of all, I'm always told, although I use Excel for a range of things, I'm always told by people I only ever use the sort of 1% of what Excel can do. But kind of it doesn't matter because Excel does what I want it to. So maybe there's an element with all these systems that if they work for us, even if they can do, even if they're far more powerful than we use, as long as they work for what we're trying to use them for, they're good. The other thing, I remember talking to somebody in architecture who told me about the idea in architecture of lines I believe they're called, where if you just look at a park and see where people have walked across the grass rather than sticking to the path, it's kind of how people use the environment rather than how environment's set out. And I suppose it seems to me in terms of a lot of technology that kind of works as well. We may read a book which tells us how to use Zoom, but actually how we use Zoom is what works for us, and as users we kind of make up a world. And maybe part of this is just sort of establishing those norms of how we want to use Zoom or Teams or other things.
We all do it though. If you think about our modules, we sit down and we determine what we think our students need to know, and we then fill in the gaps for them. And very often they will go in different directions than we initially thought, and then we look at it at module review and we work back to it. Everybody does it. The problem is that some of those kind of guidance, they kind of get stuck, like the stuff on my reading list that nobody ever looks at. Because nobody ever looks at it, it never really gets a proper going over, and therefore it never really gets reviewed because nobody's looked at it. And therefore I think that you need to have users, whether that be students or staff or whoever it may be, looking at some of this stuff. Just because we're not as clever as the people who wrote it are, it's as simple as that. We just don't know as much about Excel or Zoom or whatever it may be, and therefore we do need a bit more information, and we need it to be in an obvious place for us. And it isn't always. Apple have made a fortune on trying to put things in the most obvious place. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Excellent. Moving on to the next question, one from Pete Woodcock. Okay, in a world where we keep on getting lots more systems added, and if we look today, university catalogue of the number of systems available to us now, it's mushrooming, and new systems and software come in all the time. How do we ensure that, how do we kind of create a joined up approach for staff and students, so there isn't just more and more, but there's some sort of logic and interaction between the systems? Any thoughts?
I think it's very difficult. Again, this is a debate that we've had at the University of Leeds. I'm sure that many colleagues have been involved in it. Do you have consistency, i.e. you pick one system and you stick with it? Or do you allow people to use the different systems that they feel works better for their modules in a pedagogic way? And even within our faculty at Leeds, we've picked different approaches. And it's based upon not just what works pedagogically, but also what the staff and the students are capable of using. Some staff are better at one system than another. I'm not sure is the obvious answer. I think that there will be a certain amount of streamlining because universities won't want to pay to have 5 different systems running at a time. If you think about how expensive something like Blackboard Collaborate Ultra is, for example, or the licensing for Microsoft, which Teams comes through, they're not going to want to pay massive amounts of money for duplication. So I think they probably will kind of streamline a little bit. But the obvious answer is that I don't really know, to be honest, because even within my own school, it can be tricky to pick one system and make it work for everybody. If you then try and get the School of Medicine to follow the same rules that we do, it's going to be very tricky. And I don't know about other universities, but at the University of Leeds, for example, many years ago, we decided we got on the ethics committee train, and we used the School of Medicine's pre-existing ethics form, right? Which is very, very, very extensive. It took about 5 years to be rewritten. And let's face it, if I'm talking to you, John, about politics, I don't need the same kind of ethics committee oversight as if I'm chopping off one of your limbs. And therefore, there is a sense in which if you pick one system, well, which school, which faculty is going to be the winner in that fight? So I don't entirely know is the actual answer. I tend to think universities will gravitate towards certain systems rather than others. But I honestly don't know. I guess we have to become a kind of jack of all trades and a master of none. But that's pretty much our entire careers for many of us. So, yeah.
Thanks. A further question now from Donna Smith. How do we know what students want in a world where we could now offer entirely, maybe in a year, who knows, in a while, entirely back to face how it used to be, or entirely online, or hybrids, and every hybrid is a different mix and a muddle of different things? What's the challenges there in working out actually what students want, and should what students want just drive it? And what's, I suppose, our role as educators in terms of determining what the future should look like?
Yeah, I mean, there is a sense of relentlessly asking them. I don't think our students have ever been faced with more questionnaires than they're currently faced with. But there is an argument that was put forward many years ago about NSS, that you don't necessarily know what's in your best interests until you're kind of at the end and in employment, as opposed to when you are actually a student. There is a sense in which we have to make students do certain things. It's why, approaches to political analysis continues to be on the books of just about every political science program in the country. There are things we expect you to know. There are things that we have no choice but to teach you. But in an ever increasingly competitive world where students are paying a lot of money to be in schools, there is a sense in which being student friendly is an increasing commodity. So the honest answer is that it's a bit of both. We have to sit on the fence, but we have to do a bit of what we think is in their best interest. We have to do a bit of what they want, and we have to try and pick a middle path. I suppose the other thing that comes in is that I don't know about your students at Leeds Beckett, John, but I can tell you about my students. Most of them are angry. They are angry about the world in which they find themselves. They are annoyed about the fact that they have come to university, they're in the middle of COVID and they hate it. And they want to punish somebody. They want to kind of wag the finger at somebody. And we get questionnaires through where students will ask them questions and then at the end in the other comments, they'll say, it's really unfair that we can't be on campus. Well, yeah, it is really unfair that you can't be on campus, but we can't physically change that because we're in this environment. So there is a sense in which students will be unhappy. There's not a lot we can do about that. So yeah, it's a very politician's answer, isn't it? A little bit of what they like, a little bit of what we think. But the only thing you can do is to kind of constantly keep reviewing it. And I don't think that a certain amount of review is a bad thing. Kind of continual questioning, I think, is problematic. They just get kind of fatigued by it all. But I don't know what else you could do, really. If anyone's got a better idea, I'm all ears.
Excellent. A question from Penny Welch now. How can we support students and staff when they come back onto campus, given that, some students will, I'm thinking of perhaps students over the past year who, let's say, just coming to the end of the year now, most of the time they've spent at university has been perhaps in blended online, maybe a lot of it spent away from the town in which they're studying. And actually coming onto campus, being in crowds again, may be a very disconcerting experience for people. How do you think we can support staff and students in that?
I think it's very tricky. I mean, I have my own concerns. I've basically been holed up for a year in my house talking to people through a computer screen, other than the occasional trip out to a supermarket. That's the highlight of my social life. I think we're all quite anxious about everything. And honestly, I don't know. I was talking to a colleague the other day who wanted to not quite have a party, but it certainly had kind of, suggestions of a party atmosphere that went with it. And I think it's important to get people back on campus when it is obviously safe to do so. But I think it comes with problems, because if the universities do want to hybrid teach, the infrastructure isn't there yet to do it. So it seems to me that we're probably going to go backwards before we go forwards. But I do think, again, I'm all about the money. I'm so from Yorkshire, but it's all about the money. You have to put in all of this infrastructure. You have to have more members of staff, and that means more counselling. It means more administrative staff, more support in the libraries for students who have, we've got first years who've never been in a university library. We've got second years who had only spent 6 months going into a library. So we've got all of those things to deal with. We need support for staff who are going to be doing more. Student numbers are in many areas going up. They're going to have to face off with more students. This all takes time. So I'm afraid it's all about the money. It's about getting the support in to help people to feel comfortable doing the things that we basically expected them to know within a couple of weeks of being on campus before. Money. I can't think of any other really good solution, because we're nice, friendly people. University campuses are generally, I hope, nice, friendly places, and we can recreate that. But you need support in order to get people who are feeling nervous and upset and worried and out of their depth and are dealing with worries over kind of, am I learning the things I should do? What's going to happen to me when I finish my degree? How do I feel about my grandmother, who I want to go see, but I'm still really nervous? All of those kind of things. It's really about having that support in place, and it does come down to money. I should have called this the money webinar.
And I think there's an interesting question there as well, I suppose, the kind of what I think of as being the educational long COVID effects of, we're going to have students who have been at university for a while and haven't picked up some of the skills they might ordinarily have picked up. We're going to have students coming with their BTECs and A-levels who have had that disrupted. And indeed, even in 10 years' time, we'll potentially have students who's coming to us whose early literacy and numeracy skills, perhaps an early socialisation in primary schools has been disrupted now, who may still be trying to work through some of those things. So, it won't go away quickly, will it?
No, it won't. And if you think, for example, about the students that come to university, usually they've sat examinations. So you have, I'm not the biggest fan of examinations per se, but you have a certain number of those who were predicted to get a grade and then didn't quite make it for whatever reason that may be, and that's awful for them, but that's how it is. Now we're taking all of those students. So inevitably, some of those students under normal circumstances wouldn't have come to Nottingham, Leeds, Sheffield, Warwick, whichever university you have to think of. And those students may need additional support simply because in previous times they wouldn't have got to us, but they have got to us. So we need to be able to support them. There's more people on campus, there's more people in classrooms. All of those skills have to be taught to a greater number of people.
Your comment on exams is a perfect segue to the next question, which is from Stephen Thornton, which is, have we seen with this the end of the 3-hour exam in the drafty sports hall, given that so much, we've had to stop and we couldn't do them last year. We probably can't do them this year. So if we've got out of that habit, will we ever go back to the 3-hour unseen exam?
I hate exams. I absolutely loathe them. And I say this as somebody who had to on medication for their nerves during their finals. I am not an exam person. I doubt that we've seen the end of them. Because if we're going to have a well-rounded curriculum that has a variety of different assessment methods in it, then it could easily be argued that exams should be part of it. Particularly for the big courses. If you've got a course with 300-400 students on it, it can be difficult to get through 300 or 400 3,000-word essays, but an exam can be a lot easier. So I doubt that they have disappeared. I don't personally like them. I spent quite a lot of time at the University of Leeds lobbying to get rid of the exam that I oversaw, and this year I finally did it. So yeah, I doubt it. To be fair, there are students who excel at exams, so I think perhaps it would be unfair to remove them entirely. It is rare in life that you need to recreate exam conditions to perform any task, but I doubt that they have gone. they're already, I suppose it depends on the university. At the University of Leeds, they are used in certain circumstances, but they're not used very, very extensively. So if you were doing a degree within Polis, for example, you could sit an exam if you wanted, but you wouldn't necessarily have to sit one. If you're in the School of Medicine, it's a different kettle of fish. So I doubt it, but I don't think that we're going to see them being all the rage again in the future.
Okay, now another question from this time from James Strong. Do you have any thoughts on how we strike the balance between, on the one hand, give it being supportive of students and taking account of all of the circumstances that they're facing at the current time, and the point you raised earlier about ensuring that the value and robustness of the degrees that they have are equal to previous years, when obviously study conditions were very different. So how do we strike that balance?
I think the only way that we can do it is to uphold the standards that we have, but give more freely of our time. And that comes obviously with time implications. So for example, my third years, I've had more emails about their marks this term than I do normally. And they've all been very good. I've had to give very detailed explanations of why they have received some of the marks that they've got, and they've all gone away happy, and that's absolutely fine. But I think that there is a sense in some students that they don't want equality, they want generosity, because it's been so bad for them. And if I were a student, I probably would as well. I would think, the world has been awful to me, give me my first. But the only way that we can do it really is to be as stringent as we normally are, but offer support. If we aren't stringent, the university degree becomes worthless or worth less. They don't want that. They don't want to spend that much money and it become a meaningless piece of paper. They don't want people going, well, the class of 2021, they're not quite as good as the class of 22, 23. So we have to keep those standards up, but it does take more time. It's more hand holding. It's more support. There is a line to be drawn with the hand holding. There is a line to be drawn with the level of support. But yeah, I've done more office hours, more Q&As, more everything, more feedback than I've ever done. And it has been absolutely necessary in order to do it. And I think most of us have. I don't think that's a unique experience. So keep the standards as they are, keep the feedback as detailed as we possibly can, but know that more and more of our time has to go on things like student contact hours, because there's just no other way that we're going to get through it. Otherwise they feel abandoned. They feel more remote anyway, and I think that they feel abandoned if we're not stepping up a little bit more.
Okay, thank you. We're just coming up to 5 to the hour, so it's time to wrap up. Just a few sort of parting comments. One of the things, Victoria, that you sort of spoke about earlier was how, on the one hand, it means that we have less conversations with, if you like, the colleagues we bump into when we go to get a cup of tea, but we have other conversations. And I think it's wonderful to see all of the colleagues on the call today. And usually we wouldn't have been able to all talk with one another on such a regular basis without these series of seminars from the PSA, and without the opportunities that Zoom gives us to be together when we're apart. Secondly, a advertisement for the PSA annual conference. The PSA annual conference, which is being convened this year by colleagues over at Queen's University Belfast, is open for registration at the moment. It runs between 29th of March and 31st of March, and it's entirely online, as you'd expect. And you can register for that now and hear a range of excellent panels and speakers, including a number of teaching and learning roundtables. So I encourage you to do that. And finally, just to say thank you to Victoria. Everything may be gloomy and bleak in terms of COVID, but you've certainly given us lots to think about and lots to look forward to, and some real elements of optimism and how we can move forward in the future. So thank you very much, and thank you to everyone for attending.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.